I was at the Philadelphia convention where Hillary Clinton got the nomination, where they leaned so hard into the history making nature, right? That she wore white because of the suffragettes. She was there to be the first woman nominated by a major party, to be the first female president. That was a core part of the messaging. What I thought was so interesting is that with Harris, they didn't really talk about it.
Hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics in 2024. We also care deeply about pastries. Today, we're going to talk about the recently concluded Democratic National Convention that was held in Chicago. A little bit of time has passed since the convention concluded. So rather than get into what were the big moments and big speakers from night to night, we're going to try and assess the overall quality of this convention, talk about its successes and failures, and its likely impact, if any, on the presidential race. Now, John, as I understand it, you were actually there at this convention.
I was there.
Which I was not. And I was hoping, just to start off, could you give us an idea of what was your role there? What were you doing there? What kind of access did you have?
I was there to enjoy it and to take part in it. I think, like a lot of Democrats, was not looking forward to the convention over the last year, had made no plans to attend. And then after Harris became the candidate, and after, we saw this wave of enthusiasm and, people donating money, people giving online, people, wanting to be part of this. I think everybody's sense of what the convention was going to be like really changed. So I decided to go about a week before the convention started, largely just because I wanted to be part of that. One of the benefits of the convention is that it gets the family back together and it gets everybody excited, motivated for the final stretch. And I wanted to be part of that. So I was there mostly to see old friends, to see current and potential clients, to do a lot of networking, to do a lot of handshaking, and to take part. So I got credentials by convincing a lot of old friends of mine that they remembered their old friend John and they wanted to help me out, and got invited to some great parties. Got invited, to be in the convention hall. I wasn't on the floor because I didn't need to be. But I was
Right.
in the bowl of the arena, along with thousands and thousands of other people. Like the biggest, if you weren't on the floor at the convention, there were a lot more credentials given out than there were seats. So you got a little bit Thunderdome-y up at the top, where folks, many nights I had better credentials than the seats that I could get, because those seats filled up 5 or 6 hours before the main speaker started. So, which, I think says something about how much enthusiasm there was from the broadest possible Democratic Party. Lots of donors wanted to be there, lots of operatives, lots of staffers, lots of elected officials. It was a really hot ticket this year, which was great to see.
Wow. So, I appreciate those reflections, particularly about the enthusiasm there. And I mean, that was pretty palpable just to watch it on TV. One thing that stands out to me about this convention is that, obviously it came less than a month after the likely nominee announced he was stepping down.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of work to do in a very short period of time for something that is usually planned over a period of years. So given that, my impression is that the party did a pretty remarkable job putting together a convention that promoted an entirely different presidential nominee, a vice presidential nominee no one outside of Minnesota had heard of a month earlier. What was your impression of the success they had in pulling this off? I mean, did you see like evidence of sort of like last minute stuff coming together there, or?
I thought it was incredibly successful. I think the team that did it, led by Stephanie Cutter, Mignon Moore, who is the chair of the convention, these are pros who have been doing these for a long time. I think Stephanie Cutter was the sort of genius behind the previous Democratic convention, which had to move from being in person in Milwaukee to being online with pretty short notice. So I think there are a lot of folks who are really good at this in our party. We're lucky to have them. I think the candidate changed, but there also was just a huge uptick in people who wanted to be part of it. I think a lot of people did what I did and decided to come at the last minute. So it did feel a little bit like they were riding a tiger. And I think they did a really good job. But there were a couple points, getting into the hall was really hard because I think when they originally designed the security flow, they thought there were going to be more protesters and fewer attendees. Now there are a lot fewer protesters and a lot more attendees. So, yeah, it felt a little bit like overkill on some days, but they adapted really well. No, I think the only thing that I saw that you say, well, okay, somebody should have done, there were some references in the platform to Joe Biden's second term that somebody should have
Ah,
gone through and edited out.
yeah,
But
you want to look
we
for that
have a
stuff.
real
Yeah.
platform process, unlike the Republicans, which had an all caps bullet list from Twitter. So that's going to happen sometimes. But no, it was. I thought they did a great job, sort of highlighting Joe Biden on the first day and then pivoting to the new team.
Related to this, and this was among the people I was watching with. There was this idea that it seemed like there were just a lot of speakers from night to night, and some nights the program ran kind of long. I mean, these things are not very unusual, but I was sort of wondering how much of that was a legacy of having to throw together a nomination at the
Yeah.
last minute and sort of rewarding people who had helped make this, smooth over the nomination process.
I don't think there was much of that. This is my fourth Democratic
Okay.
convention. I have my first one was Boston back in 2004, and this is the fourth one I've attended in person. And there are always a lot of speakers, and the programs always run really long. And I think some of that's just the inherent structure of the Democratic Party, that we are a big tent, which everybody loves to talk about. But you need labor leaders, you need donors, you need African American leaders, Latino leaders, Asian American leaders, gay leaders, veterans, small business. We are a party that's very aware of the coalitions that make up who we are, and folks take really seriously the idea of representing those pieces, as well as you got to introduce the nominee, you got to introduce the VP, and we have a lot of previous sort of party eminences that want to be there, which I think was one of the biggest contrasts between us and the Republican convention, right? At the Republican convention, there was no previous Republican president, no previous Republican presidential nominee, no previous Republican vice presidential nominee even showed up at the thing. Whereas, we had every living Democratic president, save Jimmy Carter, who was technically a delegate, but did not make it, there and wanted to give them space. And, those are folks that you can tell them to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, but once they get up there with the camera, they're going to do what they want to do. I could see Bill Clinton's teleprompter from my seat in the arena. And Bill Clinton did not read a single word that was on his teleprompter the entire speech. There were some bullet points that somebody had written down, and he was going to say what he wanted to say. The teleprompter operator that night absolutely deserved hazard pay, because they were doing their best to try to keep him moving, but he was on stage, he had his time. So yeah, I think that sense of a ton of people doing a ton of things is very just core to who the Democrats are as a party. And I think that would have been the case in it may have been even more pronounced if Biden had been the nominee again, because they would have wanted to create as much enthusiasm and get as many other voices up there as possible. But yeah, it was an interesting contrast, though, I thought, with the Republican convention, which I know you were at, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. The Democratic convention felt to me like a celebration of the Democratic Party with Kamala Harris at its head, whereas the Republican convention felt like this is about Donald Trump and that's the end of the story. Did you get that sense watching from home, or?
Yeah, and I think this, just to touch on something that you just mentioned about, sort of like the past presidents up there. This was really striking to me, and one of the things that was the thing that Julia Azari and I had written on back during the Republican convention in Milwaukee, that for the most part, the Republican office holders that spoke at the Republican convention were overwhelmingly people who had run against Donald Trump in primaries and been defeated by him. Basically foes he had vanquished: Ted Cruz, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, people in 2016 and 2020. There were, as you pointed out, there were no previous Republican presidents or vice presidents. Basically every Republican who was prominent before 2015 was simply not there.
Yeah.
And Whereas the Democratic one was very different. Like, obviously, Kamala Harris never actually vanquished anyone in a Democratic presidential primary, so there was none of that. But instead, what you saw was Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Joe Biden, like basically presenting her as part of a continuity of the party rather than a disruptor in the way that Donald Trump was. So, like, there was a lot of history backing her up there.
Yeah.
It still sort of showed, being, portrayed all the ways that she would be different, but it was very much saying, this is the next thing in line for our party. If you believe in this party going forward and what we've done in the past, this is our next thing. Whereas you're right that it was many ways, it was a celebration of a party. It was a celebration, really, in some ways, like the most unafraid I've seen the party of its own diversity, like really sort of celebrating that aspect of things. Whereas the Republican one, you're right, it was very organized around Donald Trump. I mean, I think for good reason that is where that party is today. But it was very much about people expressing support for Trump specifically, people criticizing the Democratic Party, but like when they're talking about the Republican Party, they were talking about Donald Trump. And they were talking about his heroism in the face of assassins' bullets and things like that, but it was very much about him.
Yeah, and I think, some of that's by necessity, that the history of the Republican Party didn't want to be there, and some of it is, and some of it is, intent that they are trying to erase a lot of what came before. I think I was joking with some friends today that in some ways JD Vance might have been a smart pick for Trump, even if he loses, because it reminds everyone that the other people in the Republican Party are even less electable than Donald Trump is. That they have remade that party to that degree. Now, you mentioned something about the party, the Democratic Convention, sort of showcasing the diversity in a way, and I thought that was the most rhetorically interesting piece of this. Is that I was at the Philadelphia convention where Hillary Clinton got the nomination, where they leaned so hard into the history-making nature, right? That she wore white because of the suffragettes. She was there to be the first woman nominated by a major party, to be the first female president. That was a core part of the messaging. What I thought was so interesting is that with Harris, they didn't really talk about it. Right. Her speech didn't really say the word woman, except for in reference to her mother, was used once. She makes history in so many ways, right? The first woman of color ever nominated to the head of the party. She'd be the first woman president, but she was much more comfortable in letting her physical self tell that story. And she didn't feel like she had to. And I thought, a lot of people have talked about her speech, and how she talked about the most lethal military, how she talked about, the greatest privilege in the world is being a citizen of the United States, a bunch of sort of conservative coded language that I thought I was sitting there and thinking, if the nominee was a white male Democrat, he wouldn't have felt comfortable saying a lot of the things that she said. That we are so aware in the Democratic Party now is, people have gotten more aware of American history, have gotten more aware of some of the structural challenges that we still face, that to talk in those ways as a white male Democrats would feel the need to caveat and to coach and to say, well, it's not perfect and do in a way that Harris, just because of who she is, didn't really need to say. And I thought it was a fascinating rhetorical approach to, go and talk about the big unifying issues and not focus on the identity, because her identity is so inherent to who she is and so clear that she didn't really have to.
I agree with you. I thought that was an interesting point, that her speech was, in some ways, yes, at least culturally, it coded somewhat conservative.
Yeah.
She didn't really emphasize being, potentially the first woman president, first woman of color president, anything like that. She did introduce herself as being an immigrant's daughter.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting. And her speech and a lot of other speeches talked about mothers and grandmothers, as opposed to fathers and grandfathers. My impression was there were probably the convention speakers, overall, probably a higher percentage were women, a higher percentage were people of color than at any president or than at any party convention before. But again, it wasn't necessarily coming out specifically in the rhetoric.
Yeah.
Which I think you're right. People were sort of letting the symbolism speak for itself, but emphasizing more unifying themes over the course of the convention.
Yeah, like, I listened to Pete Buttigieg's speech on Wednesday, I guess, and he talked about how his family wouldn't have been imaginable 20 years ago, absolutely correctly, but he didn't feel the need to say, and that's because I'm a gay guy, right? Like, he
Right,
let
right,
that be
yeah.
the context that you knew or you didn't know, but you understood what was coming. And I thought, there are a lot of cases like that where folks, just kind of relaxed into, we're a big diverse coalition and we're going to let that speak for itself. And I think really importantly, we're going to talk about the issues and we're going to talk in ways that are attempting to make folks who don't necessarily see themselves as part of that feel comfortable. And I thought,
Mm-hmm.
Harris's speech, there were a lot of, sort of conservative coded things. The crowd chanted USA. There were a lot of American flags. There were a lot of, football players and veterans, and, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
that code. It seemed to be like they're, creating permission structures so that the audience at home would feel comfortable there, even if they wouldn't have necessarily felt comfortable in the room, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, yeah.
But yeah, I think the other thing that struck me, and I'd be curious about your thoughts on this from a political science perspective, is that, the culturally big C conservative, a lot of the coding, but I thought from a policy perspective, Harris in particular was also small C conservative in that she wasn't proposing right wing things, but she wasn't proposing a lot of change. It seemed like she was approaching everything in the convention from, we can make improvements, we can do things better, but that she wasn't trying to move the ideological positioning of the party. She wasn't trying to be a disruptive force. It was really,
Okay.
you mentioned that the previous president sort of put her in their line of succession, and that seemed intentional, that let us not really rock the boat, let's get this election done. Do you think that do you agree with that, and if so, do you think that's a smart thing for Democrats to be doing right now?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and this is an area where Harris has gotten, after a month of really good press coverage, this is one area where she's gotten some criticism of not having enough policy. And I'm a little leery of that criticism because it can very easily go the other way. Hillary Clinton was criticized for having too much policy.
People love to criticize women for anything that they can.
Exactly. You're doing too much or too little of something we care about. And a point that Ezra Klein made in a recent podcast was that, she's only been the likely nominee for a month. If you had cranked out a lot of policy proposals in a month, first of all, you'd be doing it too quickly. Developing good policy takes time.
Yeah.
It should not be rushed. And also, it's not necessarily vital. That's something that would normally come out over the course of a long primary campaign, which we just didn't have in this case. But also, it's not clear that it's 100% needed right now, given that she's running for her own first term, but also in some ways the second term of the Biden-Harris administration.
Right.
She's connected with an administration that already has quite a few policy achievements under its belt. That ran on a platform that she hasn't really distanced herself from, as far as we know, she's basically in support of. And on top of that, she is running as kind of a, mainstream or center-left Democrat. We know roughly what the party stands for through its platform and through its past. More specific policy as it comes out will, of course, be welcome and great, but we have a pretty good sense of what she stands for. And so I don't know that it was really vital to have a whole lot more out there for the convention. And at this point, and honestly, the more things you have for people to take aim at, the more negative press you can have. She's had a very good run over the last month with fairly vague policy proposals, and I don't know that I would be urging her to do much different at the moment.
I also think it's a recognition that, the best case scenario for Democrats going into 2025 is a Democratic president and maybe 50 seats in the Senate if everything breaks our way. And I
Right.
think that there's some that gives her a little bit of permission that, like, yeah, whatever her ideas are on reforming Social Security and Medicare and, the entitled, et cetera, there just really aren't going to be the votes for, right? Like, there are
Right.
things that obviously a president can do, but some of the big structural change, to borrow Elizabeth Warren's phrase, that I think got Democrats so bogged down in 2020, just aren't realistic. And, to go and put a really detailed policy paper out for something that stands zero chance of becoming the law, I think, yeah, you're just giving people targets without actually having the ability to change their lives.
Yes. I mean, I guess the counter I would say is that, like, if she came out, I mean, there was recently Joe Biden proposed a judicial reform bill that she was a big supporter of. And
Yeah.
so, like, if she were to make that kind of a centerpiece of her campaign and then win the presidency, so like take what looked like a likely loss and convert it into a win while being attached to some policy, well, that presumably gives her a little bit of capital with Congress to push that sort of thing through. I don't know how much. Again,
Yeah.
if she does manage to get a trifecta, a lot of things have to go right, and it's not going to be a large one if that happens. But yeah, arguably there might be some value in being attached to some specific policy proposals if she does that.
Yeah. No, and I think, the convention had more policy than I think it's getting credit for, right? Like, she talked about
Mhm.
Gaza, she talked about the middle class, she talked about, some things she wants to do in economics. Yeah, I think the contrast with the Trump Vance ticket is instructive, right? Like, Trump has said mass deportations and no one has really followed much up on that. Yeah, I think she has gotten a little bit unfairly tarred as being light on policy when you compare her to her opponent. But, I think, uh, I joked while I was in Chicago that whoever made the giant prop book of the Project 2025 deserved a raise, because it was the one consistent unifying theme. And, that's not necessarily the Trump campaign's policy, but obviously we know that it's the Trump movement's policy. And, having it written down gives a lot of fertile room for attack. And, you can understand the Harris folks not wanting their own version of Project 2012 out there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And you're right. That was a very good prop. Just it's a big fat target. Let's literally make it a big fat target. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And, I've seen some polling recently on the Dem side that voters know what Project 2025 is and they really don't like it. So the work that's
That's
been
yeah.
put in to make this the boogeyman has been really effective. You can see that the Republicans understand that too, from, as furious as they've been trying to oppose it. But yeah, I think
Okay.
if you're a lover of deep, wonky policy in presidential campaigns, 2024 is a bad year for you, because, the policy that's out there is being attacked. The people who are the most successful are the ones who are staying out of those thickets. So I think it'll be interesting to see if that changes, the next wide open Democratic primary, if folks decide to stay a little bit more on the issues or on the values side rather than on the details side.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I thought, we talked a little bit about the contrast between the Democrats and the Republicans. Yeah, I thought, and I know that a lot of people have been sort of cautioning Democrats to not get too excited that it's going to still be a close election. And I thought that was actually the biggest contrast between what we had in the Republicans. And I'm curious for your thoughts on this, is that, as excited as Democrats were, nobody in that hall thought that this was going to be an easy race. Whereas on the
Right.
Republican side, the sense that I got watching on TV, that I've heard from people who are in the room, is that they went into that convention acting like it was the inauguration, acting like all of the hard work was done. Do you think that's fair?
I think there's a fair amount of that, and I think at the moment that was probably justifiable, in the sense that Trump was looking pretty good
Yeah.
at that point when he was still running against Joe Biden. Um, you know, I mean, if you consider like 2016 and 2020, Trump had been behind substantially in public opinion polls, and went on to make very competitive races out of them. At this point during the Republican convention, Trump was actually ahead in a number of the polls, suggesting he could
Yeah.
possibly win the popular vote. So I think they had, people who were there had some right to think that like things are breaking their way. It was hard to see how Democrats were going to get themselves out of this mess. They, as much as like one of their main themes was Joe Biden has no business running for president and should resign today, they didn't expect him to actually do that. There's been a very big tone shift in that party. And I think you're right about that. Democrats are looking again at the last two elections and saying, okay, finally, we're back to a normal election where the Democrat is going to be ahead by several points, and this whole thing will come down to a few tens of thousands of votes in 5 or 6 states. And meaning it's a nail biter until the very end. So no, Democrats, I don't think it'll be a long time before they assume they have an election in the bag.
Yeah. Maybe never again.
But they've gone from pretty sure they were going to lose this thing to thinking they've got a good fighting chance here. And that's I think about as optimistic as Democrats get.
That's a good segue to my next question for you, which is the whole concept of convention bounces. Do you think that we're going to see a convention bounce out of this convention?
Well, by the time this airs, we may actually have polling on this. But my impression is, in some ways, the ingredients of a convention bounce are there. We also live in an era where there just are not big convention bounces. In the same way that there's not big swings in public opinion for presidents, just because the country's already very polarized. What the difference here is that you had what I think was a successful convention. It was one that got a fair amount of attention. Some of it may have been sort of cheaply earned by promising a Beyonce concert that never happened. But it did draw people into candidates that Americans didn't know everything about. We've had like the last several elections have been about Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, candidates who people have been seeing for decades. Kamala Harris is still a fairly new face. Tim Walz is a very new face. So people might have seen some new things, interpreted some things in different ways, and actually like changed their opinions about some things. So there's a chance I think they could have gotten a little bounce out of this. And I think the coverage of it has been quite positive.
It has. I think that this is going to be the first year in a long time that we have zero bounces for either party.
Okay.
Right? Because the Republican convention bounce was stepped on immediately by Joe Biden dropping out. Right.
Right.
And I think that the bounce that Democrats got out of the candidate switch, I think that's as much bounce as there is in the electorate right now. Right.
That's plausible. Yeah.
And also, I think a lot of what you see is convention bounces, and to get into the polling methodology weeds here, it's really just differential non-response. It's after a convention, Democrats feel good. They want to talk to a pollster and tell them they feel good. Republicans feel bad. They don't pick up the phone. We've gotten better at polling, and we've gotten better at knowing who we should be interviewing and who we're not. And I think that impact is lessened. So I think what will be interesting to see is not, does the top line number, if you're going to vote for Harris, you're going to vote for Trump move? Because I don't think it will much. But I think some of the atmospheric questions in the polling, right? Like Harris's approval rating, does it get more positive? I think one question that I love to track is who people think is going to win, which can often be a leading indicator. And I think I would expect to see a bounce out of the convention for people thinking that Harris can win this, which, is an important, again, permission structure for some voters down the road. But I think the era of convention bounces, if it's not totally dead, it's definitely on the way out.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
The year without a bounce, 2025.
Yeah. Well, we shall see. And I'm also sort of wondering, did Robert Kennedy Jr. dropping out, kill a potential? I don't think that's necessarily a bounce killer if there was going to be a bounce, but
I think he was down to 2% in a lot of the polls that I've been seeing recently, and that 2% is very idiosyncratic 2%, right? This is not an intellectually coherent, I'm voting for Kennedy because I think he'd be a good president, right? This is all third party votes are in some degree just a middle finger to the establishment. So I don't think
Right.
very many of those folks are going to transfer with Trump, or the ones who transfer with are the ones who probably would have gone to Trump if they thought their election was close anyway. So, I think that the I can understand why the Trump campaign wanted to make a big deal out of Kennedy, because after a bad week for them, they needed some press. But I think when we look at the results in November, I don't think anyone's going to see a Robert Kennedy effect in the polling.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. Just the sort of the pro roadkill electorate, but yeah.
It'll be interesting to see though the next couple of weeks, because JD Vance has been so off the radar from the Trump world. Does Trump talk more about Kennedy? Does Kennedy do more appearances with Trump than Vance? And do they continue? Do they keep sidelining poor old JD?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And it's also notable, on that topic, the Trump campaign, went kind of quiet for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, not completely, but like, in the weeks following the Republican convention, Trump was not doing a lot of appearances. Their messaging was very spotty and inconsistent.
Yeah.
Vance was running around doing events, but they were not terribly thematically consistent. But Trump did come out, he was very active during the Democratic convention. He was doing all sorts of media and doing rallies. I don't know that there was anything sort of coherent about it other than him just sort of almost live blogging whatever the Democrats were doing and saying it was bad.
Yeah.
It's clear to me that got at least some attention in a week that's generally hard for the out party to get much attention. But I don't know that it necessarily was doing their side any favors.
No. Somebody pointed out, I'm struggling to remember who it was. I want to give them credit, but that for this month, one of the reasons that I think it has felt so different, that this is the first month since 2015 that Donald Trump has not been the main character of American politics, right? And sometimes Donald Trump being the main character of American politics has helped him. Sometimes it's hurt him.
Yes.
But he has always been the center around which everything else rotated. And that for the very first time this month, the main character has been Kamala Harris, and to some extent Joe Biden for stepping aside. And that I think it has confused him as to how he responds, right? That he is used to being able to be the assignment editor for everybody in American politics. And for the first time, he's not. And, I expect he'll get back to that, people love talking about Donald Trump, everybody, his supporters, his enemies. He's a fascinating figure for so many people. So we'll probably get back there, but it's been a nice break to have a month off.
Yes. Yeah. There was a little of that, like, in early 2021, in the wake of January 6th and in the wake of his presidency, he did go quiet for a little while. There was a brief sense of it's just like, oh, Joe Biden's just going to like staff a cabinet like normal. And like there might be some normal, and, that didn't last all that long.
It didn't last that long. No. And because during that time, you also had, Kevin McCarthy making his pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago.
Right.
And I think they re-grabbed the Republican Party pretty fast. But yeah.
Right.
So in more important topics,
yes.
I understand that you just moved and that your sourdough starter made the move with you. How did that go?
So I had a long drive. I moved from Denver to Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm going to be affiliated with Vanderbilt University for the year at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. And yes, I brought, the only living thing I had in my car other than me was my sourdough starter. And so I took 3 days to do this trip. The sourdough starter sat in hotel refrigerators every night.
Okay.
But, it's just sitting there at room temperature or hotter. It was a fairly hot time. Driving across a lot of empty space in Kansas and Missouri.
Seeing the wheat that feeds the starter where it came from, right?
Yes. And so one thing I can tell you is that like sourdough starters are pretty hardy things. They can survive this, but it did need to revive once I got here. So as soon as I got here, I went out and bought some flour, fed it some flour and some water, let it sort of kick back into gear. I really was desperate for some bread, and I made some bread with it sooner than I should have. This thing had not fully revived, and the bread is a little flaccid as a result. But the sourdough starter did survive, and I know of sourdough starters that have survived much greater indignities than just like 3 days out of the fridge.
Yeah, one of the things I love most about sourdough starters, and I can get very romantic about them, is that they taste like the places where they're made, right? That there's San Francisco sourdough became famous because the local biota in the San Francisco Bay Area has a distinctive flavor, right? And it adds a tang. And I really love the idea of, particularly when people move them from place to place, that they bring some element, right? That the starter that I started in DC, I've brought with me to Paris, I brought with me to Ohio, it's come to Minnesota, it's gone to Florida. And I like the idea that like little bits of those places have been carried along. So you're giving your starter more complexity. You maybe have picked up something in Kansas, but definitely will get something in Nashville.
I mean, I really hope so. My understanding is that starters, after enough time, they just sort of start to smell like the place they're living in.
Yeah.
I don't know how much history they actually carry to them, but I like to think it's picked up a little bit over the...
It's a little bit of your journeys.
Yeah.
My starter is named First Lady Rosalind Starter, and one of her children is June Starter Cash. And so that feels very appropriate for Nashville.
Wow. Oh, crap. Yeah. I've got to come up with a good name for mine now.
Yeah, you do. Okay. I highly recommend starter puns. They are terrific.
Okay. And let's see. And one other thing I would add is that, I just was at a welcome back to school event hosted by the Department of Political Science at Vanderbilt, graciously hosted by the new department chair, John Sides. And apparently they have a tradition in their department for having baking contests. And they did a cookie contest at this party. So like, I love being attached to a department that has that cares about baking. It's something that, they put that forward. They value that. This means a lot to me. I did submit some molasses spice cookies that I've done very well with. Those have actually won some awards back in my home institution. They did not win at this party. So obviously I'm maybe I'm a little too attuned to the Mountain West. I've got to sort of learn my biome here now that I'm in the South, but I'll figure it out.
Acclimatized to Southern tastes,
Yeah, exactly.
You need some bourbon, some brown sugar.
Got a sweet tooth here. Yeah.
I love a molasses spice cookie. So send me the recipe for that, because it's
will do.
It's starting to turn toward fall in Minnesota, and that's definitely molasses season.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been great.
Yeah,
chatting.
It was great chatting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll talk to you soon.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you all for listening today, and we'll have a new episode for you soon. Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Masket. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.